Hi, so in this final video, we're going to produce an animated GIF from video, and the end product will approach a true cinematograph. Most of the steps involved in doing that we've already done in the previous videos using photographs or using animations, but there are some things unique to working with video that we're going to work on in this lesson, and also sort of producing a true mask, layer mask. In this lesson, we will look at importing video frames into layers, creating an alpha mask, and a few sort of creative tips for sort of working with video, working from video to create GIFs. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to open Photoshop. With the photographs and the still animations, we created a lot of the layers and frames from those layers once the content was in Photoshop. With video, this is one of the things that makes it kind of unique. When you first import video, you're going to tell Photoshop to create basically the layers it needs and the frames as a kind of consequence of that from the video itself. And we talked about this early on, that typically video is shot at 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second, depending on sort of what the videographer's intentions were. You want far fewer frames than that generally per second, and that's one of the things that Photoshop will allow you to do when you import from video. So I created a small video that's on my desktop for the purposes of this demonstration, and I'm going to import it. So I'm going down to import from file and then import video frames to layers. I'm going to select that video. And I get this window, and this window is a little bit like, on the one hand, it's a little bit more sophisticated than if you think back to the import window that we looked at with image flip, but in other ways it's sort of simplified. Again, one of the issues in using video is, how much of your original clip do you want to use for your loop, and how many frames from that original clip, typically shot at somewhere between 24 and 30 frames, do you want per second. So Photoshop is going to let me basically make those decisions as I import this video. Now, so I'm going to select the range of the video clip that I wanted, and I'm going to select the number of frames that I wish to use from that original video clip. Now, one of the reasons, and I mentioned this before, that a lot of times with video and some extent with photo, I like to do some of my pre-production in another program. It might be Premiere or Final Cut or even iMovie, because Photoshop, you can see this window is pretty small, and as I try and pick my in point and output point, it's not really smooth in how it works. So it makes it hard really to fine tune it. And if I were doing this GIF for professional production, I would spend a lot more time working on that in point and out point, making the video loop more smoothly. But for our purposes, just because that takes so much time, I don't want to make you sit through that. So the first thing I'm going to do is pick my in point, right? And you can see this was shot in the subway here in New York. And what I want to do is make that train appear to be looping in the station in the final GIF. So I'm going to, you can see that right edge. Once that little sort of guardrail is gone, that's going to be my endpoint. Now, one of the things that it's difficult to tell here is that as that train was coming into the station, it was slowing down. So what happens is there's kind of a hitch in the loop as the train slows down if I let it play to the very end. So I'm going to back it off, and I know it's hard to tell from this video, and I just know from experience that I'm going to back it off to about here. And that will give me the loop I wish. And you can see it didn't really retain where I had put this originally, and this is just one of the kludgy little features of this. So now I'm going to play the little portion of the video clip that I'm going to want from my GIF. Right? And there you have it. Now, again, this was shot at 30 frames per second. If this little clip is 3 or 4 seconds long, that's easily 100 frames, which is more than I wish for the GIF. So the choice always with the frames that the number of frames in your GIF will depend on the overall file size and how smoothly you want it to run. For my purposes, for the demonstration, I'm going to pick about, every fifth frame it's going to choose from the 30 frame per second, about 3 seconds of this loop, which should give me somewhere between about 10 and 15 frames in Photoshop. So now I'm going to import it. And again, these numbers are going to change depending on the GIF you wish to produce and what you want the final output to be. Some other factors might be, do you want to speed up motion? That may influence how many frames you choose. Do you want to slow down motion? That may influence how many frames you choose. And we talked about different ways to do that. So I'm going to OK, chug, chug, chug. It imports the frames, and I need to, just kind of a weirdness of Photoshop, I need to tell it to open the timeline. There's a timeline. So it has created frames and layers from my GIF. And I'll just play it real quick so you can see what we got. Right? And they're about 13 frames. And again, for my purposes, I'm not going to spend a lot of time fine-tuning this, but I do want to do a couple things here. One of the things that I think is important is because this is taken from video, it's got that very long, narrow 16:9 ratio. I want this to approach something a little bit more photographic in its proportion, in its aspect ratio. So I'm going to crop it here. Right? And the exact dimensions of the crop and will depend ultimately on how you want the presentation of your GIF to appear. But I'm going to crop it there. I also, because this was taken from video, it's at that 1080 HD resolution. So this is a very large file, and we saw how it can create display problems if it's too big. I don't know exactly how big I want this to display, but as a default, I'm going to make it 800 pixels along that horizontal or longest edge. And I'm going to make it a little larger so you can see it, right? Now, the other thing is you can see one of the issues as you move from software program to software program with video and to some extent with photo is, they don't all sort of manage color perfectly the same way. So while this looked good when I shot it and this looked good when I was sort of prepping the video, it looks awfully orange and green in Photoshop. And in part, that's just because the lighting in the subway isn't great. So what I'm going to do here is desaturate this. Now, I need to make sure you're at the top of the stack and the first frame if you want this mask, this to affect every frame. So I'm at the first frame here. I'm going to click the 13th frame. They're reversed. We talked about this in previous videos. And now I'm basically going to desaturate this image a little bit. And I like that red color in the hoodie. So I don't want to desaturate all the way to black and white, but I'm going to cut some of the color just to make it a little bit more interesting. And this is sort of beyond the scope of this tutorial, but there are filters in Photoshop. You could actually manage the color for creative effect quite a bit. So I'm going to play my GIF, and there you go. And I mean, arguably, at this point, we're done. We've created a GIF. But in the interest of creating a cinematograph, you can see how the couple on the left of the frame, there's that weird repetitive kind of motion. I want to get rid of that. I want them to be perfectly still, but I want that train to appear to be rolling continuously out of the station. And that's what we're going to do next. So once again, this is where Photoshop gets very, very kludgy. So workflow and the order in which you do things and saving things at each step becomes important. So I am very careful here that I am in the first frame when I do this next step. Right? And I'm clicking the 13th layer. Right? So I'm going to tell it now, hitting Control, Shift, to duplicate this layer, to duplicate that 13th frame. And convention is that you call this the alpha layer. Right? And now you can see it's on top of the stack here, right? And I play my video, and it doesn't appear to have changed at all. But if I tell it to play with the alpha layer selected, it's frozen. And the reason for that is essentially what I've done in the layer stack is created a still image that sits on top. So in reality, as far as Photoshop's concerned, this GIF is playing underneath, right? But you can't see it because that alpha layer is selected. So that's where, if I want to basically have that alpha layer appear, but I want to have essentially the appearance of the train rolling through the station, I'm now going to create a genuine mask. Note, I've got my first frame selected and my top alpha layer selected in the stack. I can use any of the selection tools to create that mask. And the tool I'm going to use here is the quick selection tool. I would be much more sort of refined in how I do this if this were for professional production. But all I really need to do for my purposes is select that train, right? And I'll get rid of some of that slop. Another thing to point out is because this was shot with video, it is essential if you want this to play smoothly that the camera be stable. So this was on a tripod, got to be on a tripod. If you think back to the image, the still image GIF we created of the building exterior from Florida, you know, that jumped around a little bit, and that was because it was created with a camera that wasn't stabilized. So you could see a little bit of motion in hand movement, right? So now, because this is perfectly stable, I don't need to be so careful. So I've selected loosely the area of the train, and I just messed up my selection. Let me add to that. Right. Now I'm going to delete, basically, in the alpha layer that's selected in the layers panel, that portion of it, right? Now I'm just going to deselect this, and I play it. There you have it. So what I've just done is created a layer mask that gives me a cinemagraph-like GIF. If I were being especially careful about this, I might fine-tune exactly the in point and the out point of when that train goes out of the station, but that is it in a nutshell. The last thing we're going to do that we should always do with these before we save and export is just, save it for the web and preview it. So we know that it's going to play okay in a browser. And interestingly, Photoshop's a little slow to run, so you can see it's faster here. You may want to slow it down, let each frame play a little bit more slowly, but that's the idea. Congratulations, we've created a cinemagraph.